Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this week's WIOA Wednesday webinar, which will focus on braided funding and WIOA. We have Nate Anderson with us today from Jobs for the Future. Usual housekeeping items to cover before we turn it over to Nate. Chat pod on the left, you will be able to place your questions or any comments there during the presentation. We will answer those as soon as we can and appropriate during the presentation. Everyone will be muted on the telephone lines until Nate is done with the presentation. But at the end of that, we will open the phone lines up, so if you would rather wait to utilize that method of asking or a question or making comments, please do so. In the bottom left of your screen is the files pod where you can download and print off the PowerPoint presentation that Nate will be using. And with that, I will turn this over to Nate. We appreciate you joining us today and providing us with the information on braided funding.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me on for WIOA Wednesday. I didn't know that it happened often enough that it could have the name WIOA Wednesday, so that's I hope that they've been helpful in the past, and I hope that today's presentation will be helpful as well. My name is Nate Anderson. I'm a project director at an organization called Jobs for the Future, which is headquartered up in Boston, although I live in the D.C. area, and we have a California office as well. My organization I'll start advancing slides. Hopefully that moves forward so everyone can see it. My organization works across the spectrum of K-12 all the way through adult education and community colleges to focus on providing opportunity for low-income individuals that face barriers to there's academic success and career success, and open up opportunity for them to be able to pursue jobs and ultimately careers that allow them to escape the cycle of poverty. So we really work in a very broad space. We work in a number of states in the country. My background is more in the adult side of our organization, and so historically I've worked a lot on career pathways, both for adult ed students and community college students, and I've done a lot of work with the workforce system and community-based organizations as well in that space. So the reason why I'm talking about braided funding today, and sort of the impetus for it, although my work is bigger than this now, is something I think many of you might be aware of, which is the accelerating opportunity model, which is in 5 states, is currently actually more than that, but started about 5 years ago in 5 states, and worked to open up career pathway opportunities for individuals that were in adult education programs who didn't have a high school diploma or GED, and then enrolling them in community college programs sort of simultaneously while they were pursuing their GED. So what it did is kind of streamline the educational process there to allow those individuals to move as quickly as possible into and through those post-secondary programs. Now, the problem with that model is when we started it, the federal rules on Pell changed so that ability to benefit was taken away, which was our primary funding mechanism. So suddenly we had thousands of students enrolling in these programs that didn't have access to federal financial aid that we thought were going to. And so we had to invest in a fairly significant effort around braided funding to try to answer that question. How do you pay for students' tuition costs using funding streams that are not federal financial aid or are not predicated on whether or not the individual has a high school diploma? And so we did work across the 5 states, meeting with state teams and local teams, developed a toolkit all around trying to answer that tuition question. And since then, I've had opportunities to do braided funding work beyond this more specific model, talking with different state agencies in states that are not doing accelerating opportunity around this sort of bigger question. So I've had a fair amount of experience at this point kind of engaging in these initial conversations, so I'm going to share kind of my observations and key takeaways from that process as kind of an introduction to thinking about braided funding. I should say normally when I do this type of work, the introductory piece is more of kind of like a day-long session, and then we do multiple engagements after that. So this is truly just introductory, and I really welcome your thoughts on what you might be able to do with this information and your thoughts on moving forward on this, because I know as you all are thinking about WIOA and the challenges of creating more sort of integrated partnerships, this question of funding is certainly a critical one, and you're in the middle of thinking about it. So I welcome your feedback on it. All right, so let's start a little bit with, so what is braided funding? And there, you can kind of, the name shows up more often now than it used to, and so you'll see it connected to WIOA. Certainly, it showed up before with some early publications from organizations like CLASP. Really kind of spearheaded some of this conversation around it. It's, of course, been around for a very long time, and many of you are very familiar with it. You've combined funds to pay for creative programs and to pay for solutions that you were experimenting with all the time. So it's not a new idea, but the sort of approaches that people take and the trying to bring in a bigger tent, bringing in more funding streams, more partners, that approach, I think, is what we're really trying to do with our work, and to try to provide resources and tools that help individuals do that at the local level. So let's start with the basic definition. So I like to think of it as two aspects to braided funding. One is the streams, which are the areas that you tend to think about, so the big federal pots of money, and I'll talk about those in a second, that then pass down through the state level. And then strategies. And the reason we really emphasize strategies here is because those are essentially everything else you do to manage your funding differently, as well as raise new funds or stretch your dollars further, but really are often more complicated to think about than the streams, and often take more time to develop effectively, but in my opinion are equally as important. So most of the partnerships that I work with tend to focus primarily on the streams, which is great. There's a lot to gain there, but I would really encourage you all to take some time to set aside as you sort of engage in these braided funding conversations. Set aside some time on each agenda to really talk about the strategies. So what are the other ways in which you can use your money differently? And I'll talk about details on that in a second. So streams and strategies, I'll use those words quite a bit in today, and that's the basic definition. For the workforce system, it's sometimes easier to think about it in three ways as well, so that not just the streams and the strategies, but also the sort of services and support, the in-kind work that you do. And that's, primarily when I talk about it, it's more of the kind of case management, career navigation kind of work, as well as the education services that come through adult ed and the other title partners. But it's more of the expertise that you have, and using that expertise in partnership with other agencies or other organizations that you're working with to make the programs that you're offering more effective, to have better outcomes, and to potentially increase efficiency so that you're providing more services for more people. And that's a big part of certain types of organizations. Their service and support function is a big part of thinking about braided funding, because that in-kind piece is going to be central to their contribution. So I won't talk a lot about services and support today, but keep that in the back of your mind as you kind of think about this moving forward. All right, so some examples. So streams. So when we talk about streams, that's it's acronym soup pretty much. So it's as you can see there, WIOA is a big part of that, and the four titles there, but also TANF. And the SNAP E&T funding streams are very common that we see. Community service block grants show up a lot, and those are what fund your community action agencies. There's things like veterans benefits that we deal with. There's federal financial aid, like Pell, but there are other ones out there. There's non-federal streams that show up sometimes, as well as private funding sources. So things could be like state financial aid programs, or it could be particular foundation-supported efforts where you've got a funding stream that you can tap into there. So it's not always federal, although it often is. And those are, they come in basically two flavors. One is a direct funding to an organization type to cover the costs of that organization. The other is funding that is tapped into based on the eligibility of the population served. So you're able to provide services to people that meet criteria, and then those services are then paid for by that funding stream. And then there's also some discretionary money in there as well, which is a little more flexible. But that's when people talk about braided funding, when they visualize braided funding, that tends to be a big part of it. Oh, hey, Mark, thanks for the spelling out of things. Yeah, I tend to jump too quickly into the acronyms. And then on the strategy side, so there are three ways to think about your strategies. One is on the reducing costs piece, which is a lot of kind of efficiency and back office function type approaches, where you're really trying to either within your organization or by working across partnerships, figure out how you can spend money more efficiently and stretch your resources further. The second is around raising new revenue, which some organizations, it's easier than others on this point, but it's either like a fee-for-service kind of model where you found a client or customer that's able to pay and therefore give you money that is more flexible or even or discretionary in nature. Or it's sort of other alternative strategies for raising new revenue, and there are a lot of them out there. But like I said, some organizations it's easier than others. So I find, in my experience, community-based organizations and community colleges tend to have more strategies that they can approach around this raising new revenue piece, because they do have access to tuition and fees and sort of community taxes and other things that they can pull into this category, whereas traditional kind of career center workforce side of things may not have those at their fingertips. Although that's not to say that there aren't strategies that the workforce system can use around raising new revenue. It's just a little harder. And then the third is around redirecting existing revenue, and this is where I would really encourage you all to think of yourselves as investors. You have access to a pot of money, either the money that is passed down to you directly through the funding streams that you receive to support your organization, or the money that is attached to the clients that you're serving in the field. But that money is an investment, and what you want to do with it is get the biggest return for your investment. And so in some cases, that can be redirected in a way so that you take money away from where you're not getting the best return and put it into programs where you are going to get a bigger return, and that's a way of redirecting existing revenue. So that's that third bucket there. All right. So why braid funds? This is a little bit self-explanatory, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But I think the most important way I look at it now is, there are two trends happening in the country right now that I think are, maybe three, that are really pushing the need to do this. One is there's fewer resources available in any one funding stream than there have been in the past, and in fact, in sort of real dollars, the amount of money set aside for workforce and health and human services type functions has been declining ever since the late 70s in the country. So it's less money, but more to do, that classic challenge. The second is that you're looking at the sort of momentum that comes out of WIOA and the sort of pressure being put on you all to figure out how to do things in partnership, as well as braiding funding being part of that. And then lastly, there's increasing reliance on grant money these days, sort of one-time federal grant opportunities like the Workforce Innovation Fund and the TACT grants and things like that, and the tech hire grants that just came out, or just the RFP just closed. Those are the way in which the federal government is paying for or incentivizing innovation, but isn't providing a lot of opportunity for individuals to sustain that work. And so it tends to disappear at the end of those grant periods. So I would say that from an organizational perspective, braided funding is a sort of answer to all of those three challenges. The second is from the customer perspective. I would say that braided funding done well has the opportunity to create essentially kind of a holistic experience for the customer, so that they are getting the best of the partnerships that are engaged in providing services to them. that it's well managed, that it's clear to them which services that they need to seek and why, that the process for accessing those services is streamlined and straightforward, and that it just makes for a all-around better experience and better outcomes at the end. It is that from the customer perspective, though, it is also very hard to do that, or it takes some work to do that as you all think about the customer experience. And so, it's very easy to get bogged down in multiple layers of red tape, as well as sort of assessment and intake requirements and referral challenges, so referring people too many times, or having them take the same assessments or similar assessments, or enter the same information multiple times with each partner they go to, that sort of thing. So just think about how you can, from the customer experience, braid funding in a way that makes for a better experience, not a more sort of bureaucratic and complicated experience. But the potential is definitely there. I'll mostly skip this. So I think you all are in the middle of this, so I don't need to jump into it. But the point being that I think this is pretty much I think braided funding was what, in many ways, WIOA wanted to see happen, but didn't provide the sort of impetus to make it happen. And of course, many of the barriers that you face now around braided funding have existed for a long time with the different agency funding streams and their various requirements and measurements of outcomes and so on. Mark, you're my dictionary for acronyms down there. Thank you. And so that this is really an unparalleled opportunity, and one we may not see for a while, to really actively engage around this issue of braided funding. And I think a really important piece of that is, as you all jump into this work and you discover challenges around doing it effectively, then that you can pass that back up the chain. Send that back up to your state representatives, send it back up to the executive branch and the agencies, the federal agencies that manage these funding streams. I will tell you that I've sat in multiple meetings with them where they really want to figure out how to do this well, and they're really taking it seriously, and they know that there are substantial challenges around the way that their agencies talk about outcomes and the way that their agencies restrict or require funding be spent in certain ways, but they are very much open to the idea of changing that behavior, so that, or those rules, so that it's easier for you on the ground. It'll take a long time. It won't be clean, but I'm fairly certain that because of WIOA, 5-10 years from now, you're going to see a different environment around this cross-agency work. So another sort of longer-term benefit there. All right, so let's talk a little bit about funding streams and some details on those. And again, those are mostly those federal chunks of money, but there are other examples as well. So the first four on there are your title funding for WIOA on this list, and then I mentioned several of the others of these. Some of these fit in different states. They'll fit in different places. Different agencies will control them. Although, and then they have, again, different rules and regulations in each state. So I should say, when I talk about funding streams in this presentation, I do it mostly from the perspective of the federal rules and regulations around those streams, and not from the state perspective. And that's because many of these, some of them quite drastically, like TANF, for example, they'll change a lot from what the feds say is allowable versus what state plans have included. Perkins does that as well, actually, quite a bit. So the main point being that I'm not an expert in your funding streams, nor am I really an expert in funding streams in general. I mostly work on the process of braided funding. But the good news is that you're surrounded by experts in your funding streams, both at the local level and then your partners at the state level, who can help to answer questions about allowable expenses, can help to myth bust where people on the ground are saying something can't be done, but in fact it can, and to sort of answer all those more technical questions about allowable use. So anyway, so these are a number of examples. So a couple others I'm going to talk about Perkins. Financial aid is another example of a funding stream that can start on the federal side. Trade adjustment assistance, TAA, that's where the TACT grant program came from. Like I said, there's other funding streams that are out there that you can tap into. I won't talk about these because they tend to be state-specific or regionally specific today, but just something when you do your sort of asset mapping scans, what funding is out there. This is a good category to consider as well. Don't just think about the federal big funding streams that are out there. So feel free to jump in with typed questions at any point here. Just a reminder on that. Title I, this is probably the one that most of you are familiar with, or the most familiar. And I would say that my general theme on these funding streams is that many of them are more flexible than you may realize. And it's sort of a question of how do you access the funding stream, what it's been made available for in the past versus the future, what your sort of state rules control there, and then any discretionary funding that may be available and how that's going to be used. But this adult and dislocated worker youth line is really, or title is really about supporting the career aspirations or job aspirations of individuals that access the workforce system. And so that can be everything from the more narrowly and specific uses around career services and training, as well as more flexible services around or uses around additional costs that the individual may incur to be able to get through those training programs. It does have limitations on the use, and so you have to be careful around that. But I find in general this is a fairly flexible funding stream, and one which should be part of pretty much any braided funding conversation you're having. And I'll give an example later of a use for this that I liked from one of our accelerating opportunity states. On the other opportunities, so I don't know if you all have been talking about pay for performance yet, but that's a new opportunity under WIOA, and it does have the ability to redirect funding differently based on sort of outcomes and performance that may go beyond the traditional performance metrics that you look at. So that's something to consider as you're talking about your local partnerships around this. Another use, and a number of these funding streams fall into that, and I think this is a big part of WIOA, is that co-enrollment integrated pathways concept. So that's when I talked about accelerating opportunity earlier, that's an example of a co-enrollment integrated pathways model. And all that means is you're taking individuals in who would otherwise be adult education students, or if they were enrolled in college would be remedial students. You're investing in pathways that allow them to move more quickly towards their post-secondary credential while they're working on their basic skills. And so it's specifically, in this case for Title I, it's around using the resources that you have there to provide particularly that career navigation, or in some cases the training costs for the individual to be enrolled in those post-secondary part of the pathway while they're working on their GED. Or equivalent. And the other thing here is the discretionary funds. So there are now discretionary funds sort of back in Title I that had been severely restricted in the past, and so those are always great ways to, and those are state controlled, but they're always great ways to potentially invest in braided funding efforts where in particularly you've identified a gap in your approach. So you know the model you're pursuing works. You know you have funding to cover 90% of it, but there's this 10% gap that you haven't been able to identify a funding source to address. That's where those discretionary funds may come in. So that's always a good ongoing conversation to have with your state partners on how that funding is being used. All right, so let's keep going. So Title II, so adult education. So again, I think many of you are familiar with this, but just the quick overview here is that this is spent to support individuals that have in most cases, do not have a high school diploma or GED, although, to be honest, that varies from state to state a lot. Some states serve a lot of people who do and who are just either come through the adult education door or who have significant basic skills remediation needs. But general rule of thumb is people don't have a high school diploma or GED, and or they are testing at well below college ready. And so so this service provides primarily the training component around and sort of supportive services around getting individuals to that next step. So it has again a very flexible sort of leadership discretionary format here. That's a great way to think about it from a sort of broader state perspective. From the more local perspective, I like it for the contextualized content piece for people that are lower skilled. So not just providing traditional adult education services, but focusing on adult education training that is in line with the career pathway programs that you've established through your community college partners and in support with your workforce system. And the funds can be used to design and sort of redesign adult ed in a way to align with those. It also works from the integrated education standpoint, which I mentioned earlier, integrated pathway side, and then aligning the various aspects of adult ed with the other pieces that are out there. PD is also a professional development is also a potential source of this. So this is a funding stream that in general I find is critical when you're serving individuals that will be going through the adult ed door. In your braided funding efforts, it is not as flexible a funding stream as some of the others in terms of being able to serve individuals that are outside that space. So it's mostly important that you really think about adult ed as streamlining these funding streams or customizing these funding streams so that they really are fitting the broader career pathway kind of programs that you're putting in place. So we have a comment. Mark, do you want me to just respond to that, or do you want to read it?
Yes, please do. And also,
okay.
Nate, at the end of your segment here, before you get to the slide beginning on steps for braiding funds, we've got representatives from each of the other 3 core partners, so maybe we give them an opportunity to respond or add anything else, if you wouldn't mind. Yeah, that'd be great. And so I should say normally when I do this, when I talk about this, I prefer to do it with a live setting with people in the room, because I actually ask people from each of the core partnerships to say a little bit about what they do and how their resources are spent, just to open up that door, because I can never speak to it as well as they can. So that's really helpful. Thank you. Well, Chelsea's going to go ahead and open up unmute the lines for those individuals. So you're talking on adult education. Levon Nelson can help us with that. Antoinette Golan is with the Wagner Pizer Act program here in Illinois, and then Doug Morton is with Vocational Rehabilitation. So we'll get them unmuted and have them add any additional information that they wish. That's great. And I may even, for Levon and Antoinette, I may even ask you guys to just say a little bit. The next 2 slides are Wagner Pizer and Voc Rehab. And so if you guys want to say a little bit about what you do, that would be great if you're willing to do that. So I'll just get past this in a second. So Carla, to get your question. So I'll just read it in case there are people who can't see the screen. So to me, WIOA does not encourage persons to attain a secondary completion that it takes adult ed out of the mix, or you do realize that it effectively takes adult ed out of the mix. Also, if a person does not have a secondary education, they will eventually dead end in whatever career they choose. Yeah, I think that's a great observation. My biggest concern around WIOA and adult ed is that it incentivizes individuals that are closest to being college ready, so people that are sort of NRS level 5 and 6, who have the potential to go into these integrated pathways and be successful without significant support services, although they still need support services, and that it sort of creates a creaming problem where you're really looking at adult education students at the top end of the pyramid, and not the vast majority of individuals that adult ed serves, which are at the intermediate and lower levels. And so that's where I get really worried about what WIOA is going to create long term. And so my organization has been thinking a lot about, is there a state policy solution, or is there a way we can sort of bring the attention back to people that are coming in at lower levels? Because as you point out, if they don't complete the secondary education, they really have very few job opportunities available to them. And frankly, in many places, they need even more than that, particularly if they want to escape the cycle of poverty. So I think that's a great comment, and one that I think we'll see play out over the next several years, and hopefully there's
there's some solutions out there. But in the meantime, I think your point and the one I agree with is that extra attention needs to be taken to this to the role of adult ed and WIOA as you all work on your sort of partnerships here.
This is LaVon.
Hi, LaVon.
And yeah, I just wanted to say I think that's why you see the integrated models that we're working on right now that are combining occupational training, contextualized learning while people are working on their GEDs, such as our AO and our ICAPS models, those sorts of things, because they do just that. They actually then allow for more of a connection because once they, even though they are not, the adult ed portion, what we traditionally think of the adult ed portion, there isn't a way for that really to be, quote, covered by WIOA, but the occupational training portion can be as part of training provider, service. So that, I think that's one of the things we can see some connections there. And then, in the past, without bringing up old history, part of the past issue was always around performance measures because it took, to get someone through adult ed, and then Title I is going to be measured on performance measures, and then figuring out, what is an exit. An exit is different for adult ed than it would be for Title I. So you're right, there are issues to work out, but I think these integrated models are a step in the right direction and will provide more linkage between Title I and adult ed, Title II.
It's a great point. Thank you, LaVon. And I think that's I'm glad to hear that, because I think that's, and I love to see that people are sort of taking that approach as not only seizing the opportunity presented by these integrated pathways and figuring out how to change behavior to allow for sort of broader, longer-term goals for people, but also on the other opportunities piece, the flexibility to align even earlier programming before it's technically the integrated step, where it's more around providing, as I said earlier, customizing that earlier experience so that individuals are ready to jump into those integrated pathways when the time comes, and have really determined what their career opportunities look like and are excited about what they're moving into and see the fit and so on. So that's great. All right, let's keep moving. So Wagner Pizer, so sorry, I didn't catch if so Antoinette, would you be able to speak to kind of the function of Wagner Pizer and because I know I think you have a number of different funding streams that kind of fall under this in Illinois, so I'd be curious if you wanted to sort of articulate a little bit more about the role of this funding stream.
Well, pretty much what we use this funding stream for is our Hire the Future program with regard to our career information system. Our career information system is our employment. Pretty much you can research employment is through our EINA program, Employment Economic Opportunity Program. And what they do is they research different occupations to identify employment, wage data and different things like that. And so what we do is we identify the, I'm sorry, can you hold for a second, please?
Yeah, no problem.
I'm sorry. Pretty much with economic information and opportunity area, what we do is we identify our labor market information, and we find out what the economic outlook are for different, like our Hire the Future program for the job seekers statewide. So pretty much that's where this funding stream goes to our Hire the Future program and our LMI information.
That's great. Thank you. This is a funding stream that I think falls much more in the sort of in-kind kind of category that I mentioned earlier, as opposed to one which has flexibility that enables partner organizations to really tap directly into it. But with that said, I think the sort of career services and LMI functionality is really important, and one which, as you sort of think about braided funding, where you really do want to make sure you're responsive to the labor market, there are ways in which you can access the information produced by Wagner Pizer is probably the best way to kind of think about it. And that's on the other opportunities slide there. Some states have things like they use Wagner Pizer for sort of online job banks and things like that, where you really it helps you ensure that your efforts being produced through your other career pathway programs are accurate or as accurate as can be. So that's the kind of the summary on that. And then on Title IV on Voc Rehab, Vocational Rehabilitation Services. So I don't know if it's Louis Harner. I don't know if you're on and you want to say a little bit about the function of vocational rehabilitation.
It's Lou Hamer, Nate.
Lou, sorry.
Yeah, it doesn't appear that either he's not hearing us or he's not giving us his phone number, so we can't unmute him at this point in time. But Lou, or if anyone else is with Voc Rehab and would like to speak, Chris, yes, please, if you would like to give us a phone number, we'll unmute you real quick and let you speak to your program. I think that's Chris Smith, Nate. She's the director of vocational rehabilitation. So,
oh, great.
If you would please unmute her. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. This is Chris Smith. I'm the director with the Division of Rehab Services in the Department of Human Services. We are federally funded and state funded. I think it's like a 79% of our funds are federally funded, are federal funds. We are here to support individuals with disabilities. There is a criteria that people need to come in, and when they apply for services, we look at their disability and how their disability impacts upon their ability to find employment, go to training for employment, or retain employment. So the big concern that we have in the VR program is that we serve individuals with disabilities. Our funding does not allow us to serve other individuals. So what we've really found in looking at partnering with other people is, it is being able to either develop particular contracts with other entities that might provide services for people with disabilities. It could be that we work in companionship with an entity where they're going to serve some part of that individual, maybe that isn't related particularly towards employment, and we provide the employment. Again, we provide training, we do physical restoration if somebody for some reason needed some kind of assistive technology in order for them to perform their job. That's part of the types of services that we can provide. We're also looking at, and we partner right now with a lot of school systems within the state of Illinois in providing transition services to youth with disabilities to try and work on their work skills, knowledge base, et cetera, for when they graduate, either moving into a job directly or on-the-job training that we could do, or also looking at some kind of post-secondary education, community college or college and university funding. So we are flexible in terms of we have to focus on that individual themselves and what their particular needs are based upon their disability, but then inflexible in terms of not being able to pay for someone who doesn't qualify for our services. We partner a lot, and I think the beauty of this that we often talk about, particularly currently now with the state of the state, is that those federal funds coming in really help us leverage services for our folks with people who are state funded, and currently now we're able to move forward because we have those federal funds.
That's great. Thank you, Chris. And Vicki has I don't know if you can see it, but Vicki has a follow-up question for you, and I'm going to preface that a little, her question, because I think it's relevant to sort of my follow-up question for you as well, which was, would you say that that one opportunity for vocational rehab to sort of integrate more strongly with these cross-partnership efforts and braided funding is there are a number of individuals who would qualify for your funding who have disabilities but who are falling through the system, the cracks in the system because they're not being diagnosed?
Yes,
would you say that that's
a
true?
lot of times we work with the school system and look at records if somebody, had an IEP when they were in school or a 504 student. All those individuals we can work with. It doesn't matter in terms of it. At this point in time, we don't have an order of selection for the numbers of individuals we serve. So looking at someone who has some type of a diagnosis, and then again, the more than the diagnosis, although we are required to have a diagnosis, is the idea of how that impairment or how that disability impacts upon that person vocationally. So yes, I think what we're finding is there are many folks who are not coming to our doors because they might not know about vocational rehab, or somebody has maybe made an assumption that you have to have a particular type of disability before they're referred to us. In those situations, I would always say, and you can go to the DHS website, and on the web page, the first page, home page, we have a referral link to VR. So we take referrals from anyone. So it could be a parent, it could be a neighbor, it could be anybody who might be feeling that somebody that they know could benefit from our services. And Vicki had sent a note that said, is there a plan in place to co-locate voc rehab in the job centers? Actually, we do have some offices that are co-located. Currently, I think we're looking at, when the development of the regional plans and looking at where the offices are, we believe it's important to have good partnership, and so being in a one-stop, we're looking at that when we can consolidate offices, particularly now the governor's office has made, over the past several years actually, even in prior administration, the idea of co-location makes sense for people, kind of a one-stop approach. We do have several offices within the state who are co-located, but they're co-located with their other DHS partner, which is the Division of Family and Community Supports. So in situations where we're at the point where leases are running out, we definitely are going to be looking at how we can further align our services. It just makes good sense for the customer in terms of customer service and financially as well. And I'm glad John, who I think is John Marcaro, is on the webinar as well.
Great, thank you, Chris. Appreciate it.
Sure.
All right, I'm going to keep moving because I want to get to some of the other. Okay, so we got another question from Pam. Does each agency have a specific amount of money set aside for braided funding programs and services at the local levels? And if so, how will we know how much this is? So I will attempt to answer that. Unfortunately, the answer is no. There's not a certain amount set aside for braided funding. It fits pretty much within either the core funding that each of these agencies have, or the discretionary money that the state may have. But that the point is that there is a fair amount of flexibility within those dollars that allows for, so long as either the individual served meets certain criteria, as you sort of heard Chris talking about, they needed to meet that criteria of being disabled. As long as they meet that criteria, the money can be spent in a number of different ways, and so it's really a conversation around that criteria question, as well as flexibility within the core funding itself, and whether they're able to do that. So unfortunately, it's not set, but like I said, the good news is there is a lot of flexibility there. All right, TANF, so temporary assistance for needy families. I'm going to go through these relatively quickly and summarize them. This is basically a funding stream that supports, as it says, very often very low-income individuals that have sort of family requirements, so they're parents or they have children, and it has it's basically in sort of the spirit of the program is that it's a short-term training and support program to help individuals receive whatever they need to be able to earn a job that allows them to reduce their dependence on TANF and other public assistance dollars. So it's relatively short-term compared to some of the other funding streams that are out there. It has work requirements, which also include schooling or training. So with that said, but with that said, it's actually very, very flexible. It has support for childcare, transportation, things that you hear a lot about. I'm sure you all deal with regularly, and as well as the training costs and other sort of on-the-job training type aspects there. It's one that I increasingly see in the field. TANF is coming to the table in a way that they weren't in the past. And that's because I think that they're starting to realize that there are these evidence-based models out there and approaches that the workforce system and the education systems are using that have better potential to move individuals who are on TANF off that program in a more permanent way, as opposed to the cycle that you see often with TANF recipients. And they're interested in investing in the types of models that you're doing for their particular population. So again, it's population specific here, and your state sets the rules on those, and they change a lot from state to state, but it's population specific. But once you identify someone as being TANF, then they are a TANF recipient or TANF eligible, then there's a great amount of flexibility in the way that money can be spent. And I'll talk about that as an example later as well. SNAP ENT, so I know you guys are a pilot. You received one of the round 2 pilots from the Department of Agriculture, which manages supplemental nutrition assistance. This is what used to be called food stamps, and there's an element of that that's called education and training, which is primarily for people that don't fit in the TANF mold. So they're often for either single individuals or people whose children are older, but who also need funding to be able to get off of the food stamp support. And it's very similar to TANF otherwise. It's also very flexible in the way that it can be spent. It is underutilized at a national level. It's one of the few funding streams that I'm talking about that there's money that's set aside to spend on SNAP ENT each year that isn't used. And that's for a couple reasons. One is it's always been challenging historically to be able to tap into it because of the state regulations or the regulations that were required that states need to go through or counties need to go through to access this, creating that plan basically to be able to do it. The other is that it requires, there's a small amount of funding that each state receives as block funding, but then most of the SNAP ENT funding is contingent on requiring a 50% match from the organization that's tapping into it, and the 50 or the state, and the 50% match is it's required that comes from non-federal funding sources. So that's a pretty big barrier, it seems, at first, although as I think we're seeing from some of these pilot sites, as we're seeing from states like Washington, and others, it's not just Washington, but Washington State is probably the most famous right now. It is possible to do the 50% match using either local funds or, in an ideal situation, state funds that have been set aside. So Washington State uses several state financial support grants for low-income people as their match, and then they're able to sort of tap into this. And so they've been able to, tens of millions they've been able to tap into in this funding stream over the last 7 or 8 years. So it is possible. So I see that some more questions or comments have come up, so I just want to look at them real quick before I move to the next funding stream here. Oh, I should say as well, for SNAP ENT, there's a great, if you go to the, you can just Google it, the FNS, I'm forgetting what the acronym stands for, Nutritional Services Federal, no, I'm missing it. Anyway, FNS is the sub-agency that manages this through the U.S. Department of Agriculture. They've released a number of toolkits and guides on SNAP ENT, which are actually quite good. So if you're looking for more information on how this works, both in terms of how it can be spent and then how you might be able to access it, it's worth downloading those guides because they really are comprehensive and not too bad to read. All right, so in the past, TANF has not been supportive of secondary education. How is that going to change? This is Carla's question. Is the money going to be tied to them being more cooperative? So again, your state plan is going to affect how TANF is going to be spent. But in my experience, from what I understand, there's not a significant conversation at the federal level around Health and Human Services or in Congress around changing the requirements for TANF to be more integrated with either secondary education or adult education or the post-secondary system. But with that said, because of the pressure being put on TANF agencies to move individuals off TANF and into jobs, they do see partnering with those agencies as in a more productive way, a more effective way as the primary way to achieve that goal. And so I think the culture is shifting. I think historically it was really about short-term training to get people into jobs, even if those jobs weren't well paid, as a means to get them off TANF. I think now it's becoming more about integrating TANF dollars into longer-term career pathway programs to get people into that second-tier job where they really are making the money that hopefully they won't need to go back on TANF. So it's more of a culture shift than it is a regulatory shift, I think, on that point. But again, I think it always helps to have the state conversation first, unless you already have partnerships with TANF agencies, Health and Human Service agencies locally. And so if you all can talk to your state leads and your state partners and put the onus on them to reach out and build this relationship, I think that will help trickle down to your level. And then a question, I'm not sure. Oh, it's I guess a region here. WIOA regs often state that each title is the funding of last resort. Which title is truly the funding of last resort? For example, VR. Yeah. So the funding of last resort question and challenge is significant. There is. So I have talked to local partnerships that have developed a funding of last resort sort of triage checklist, where once they've developed their braided funding strategy, they then have the checklist to be able to say what is truly a funding stream of last resort, and then they use that to identify the order of which funding stream they need to address. They need to try to tap into first. The reality is many funding streams call themselves funding streams of last resort, which is actually a good thing because then they're all at the same level, which means you have flexibility to pick and choose among them at that point. But you do have to do your homework on what the requirements are there first, and you have to build a tool to be able to address that. During the last time I did this a month ago at the conference in Springfield, some people asked if I could try to track down those resources or tools that people may have developed before around this, and I will, but it's going to take some time to get into that. But once I do, I'll make sure we post it on our braided funding site so you guys can see that. All right. Perkins, very quickly, Perkins is it's essentially a career and technical education funding stream that each state sort of decide how they're going to distribute at the secondary versus post-secondary level. It typically falls in sort of the somewhere between the 40 and 60% range where states are putting their money, whether it's at the secondary or post-secondary level primarily. But the point is it's to pay for most states use it for two primary reasons, which are capital costs or equipment costs related to career and technical education, so keeping that equipment up to date. And then, or they use it to pay for professional development for their CTE faculty and teachers. But that isn't the only way it can be spent. It also can cover special populations that's allowable under federal regulations. So in that case, it could be used for tuition, for example, or other training costs that they may experience. And so there's some flexibility here that many states do not tap into. Illinois is actually better than most, in my experience, particularly at the post-secondary side. I'm not as familiar with the secondary side, in that they've created more flexibility around this funding stream. But it is a good way to think about where it's a technical training program where there is flexibility allowed in the state plan. This is another one that the state plan affects a lot. Is there some way you could tap into this to cover some of your technical training costs so that you don't have to use other funding streams to do that, or that you may be able to bring in additional students who otherwise wouldn't be eligible for other funding streams? it's got limitations on how it can be spent, basically around no remediation or basic skills, but keep in mind with an integrated pathway model, the individuals who are taking college-level work, college-level career and technical work, that's not considered remediation even though they're co-enrolled in basic skills programs. So there's some flexibility there. And also this has, there's a discretionary state leadership fund on this, which I think is another great way to experiment with new models and new approaches. All right, in the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving. Community service block grants. These are what I said earlier. These support your community action agencies. For those of you that haven't worked with community action agencies, this is, again, a really flexible funding stream. It's one that can be used for a number of different potential costs, some of which include cash assistance for individuals, as well as everything related to your child care, transportation, training, all those additional costs that individuals incur when they're trying to enter and succeed in education and training programs. And then the case management side. The tricky thing here is really one of relationship and opening the door to these funding streams. They are controlled by the boards of the community action agencies, which have kind of an unusual structure. And they typically have been allocated historically in very specific ways. And so trying to change the way they're allocated is always, of course, a challenge. But if you enter into conversations with your partners, your community action agency partners here, and sort of in the same way that TANF agencies are beginning to sort of see the value in investing in these longer-term career pathway programs, it's a similar kind of argument with your community action agencies if they're not using their funds for those purposes. These aren't huge funding streams, and they do have high demand, and they typically go to some of the lowest income individuals in communities. So you may not have success changing the way that they're spent, but it's certainly worth a conversation or a series of conversations around that. And I have seen examples of the ways in which these have been spent in support of kind of braided funding efforts. All right, let's talk about steps. And before I keep going, Mark, we're good to go past 11, right?
Yeah, we generally go between an hour and a half on these, so we can keep
okay, all right.
We're good for another half hour.
Okay, I promise I will be done then in half an hour. All right, so let me just walk you through the steps of doing braided funding. This is something that we are going to be in the process of developing some more tools around, although I'll take you to our braided funding toolkit here in a second to give you a little bit of an example of how we built it for a specific program. So the approach, so starting with create a vision, and this is, I'll refer back to this later, this diagram, so you can see it again. But this is really the first step, particularly if you kind of don't know yet what you want to do with your braided funding efforts. You just know you want to figure out how to do it, or you want to do it to improve the effectiveness of the investments you're making or the programs you're running. So put it in red here. It's the single most important question around making this a successful effort, which is braided funding for what? And that is, a lot of people get together for braided funding conversations and sort of say like, okay, we know we need to braid funds. How are we going to do this? Which is skipping the important first step, which is what are we braiding funding to accomplish? And there are three different things you should think about, three different aspects that you can sort of focus on when you're answering this question. One is, and it's probably the strongest way to do this, is braided funding to support a specific model. That could be an integrated pathways model, like accelerating opportunity. It could be an accelerated case management model where you're moving students through educational pathways with a lot of support services, but the pathways themselves are not different. There's different ways you can think about it, but the point is it should be sort of evidence-based as best you can. You know it works. You have some idea of what the model looks like and what the costs are and how the sort of elements that you break down there. If you have that model, then it's much easier to do braided funding because you can actually do your gap analysis. Like what can you cover using existing funds? What do you need new funds for? If it's grant supported, you have a sense of what the grant funds, are paying for. So that's one way to do it. If you don't have that, another way you can is a population specific. So you could say, let's say, for example, your TANF agency comes to you and says, we really need to see better outcomes for our TANF population. Then you specifically pick the criteria that make people eligible for TANF. and then build your, and then set your goal. So your goal is reduce the number of people who are dependent on TANF, receiving TANF services by X percentage over the next, X 3 years maybe, and then you build a braided funding model to accomplish that goal. The third way you can do it is a collaborative model. That's something like collective impact or a sector strategy kind of approach where you're bringing multiple agencies and other partners. So it can include things like employers or individuals that may not be part of what I'm talking about today, but that it's a formal structure, it meets regularly, and it sets sort of strategic goals for itself. With a collective impact approach, for example, you might set a goal to reduce poverty in a region and define what that means, and then over a 10-year period aim to reduce that. Then you're braiding funds to support the goals of that collaborative. So I would encourage you to choose one of these three approaches when you think about braided funding, because it's very easy to get sort of distracted if you come at it without something very specific early on. So a specific question from Vicki. So have any states secured a funding stream to provide Wi-Fi at housing projects to support online learning for adults and children? That's a good question. So the only example I know there are where the state has set aside funding streams, funding allocations specifically to improve the internet access, and that's, in my experience, has largely been in rural areas where they've done that, but it's a very dedicated effort. It's like linesmen laying down fiber optic cables that then provide hotspots in the community to start with, so things like libraries, and then later on to provide more specific access to housing. I have not seen it as an allowable expense for any of the funding streams I'm talking about, unfortunately. And if anyone has a example different from mine or an answer different from mine, please chime in, because I certainly haven't seen it all on this question. So braided funding for what? So then the second is, so this is a question you can either enter into individually, so sit down with your internal team and begin to say, what do we really want to, why do we want to bring people to the table to talk about braided funding? Or you can do it in concert with your initial group of partners. And my encouragement on this is keep your initial partnership small. Do it with 1, 2, at most 3 agencies or organizations that you think bring a specific sort of either funding stream or expertise to the table that would be valuable. But the more people you add, the more complicated this gets, and it can quickly fall apart, particularly around how people sort of measure success. And whether or not this strategy is going to allow them to improve hit their metrics or improve their metrics. Over time, you can add more, but early on, keep it simple and use that partnership to develop your initial braided funding for what questions further as well. Oh, I should say also, a lot of these sort of happen simultaneously. It's not a do this then that. Like create a vision you need to do, but you can do that with your partnerships. So like, create a vision and develop partnerships often happen overlapping. The asset mapping and the identifying funding priorities often overlap, and in fact, as you're asset mapping, you may discover holes and realize you need additional partners, and then you go back to develop partnerships. So this is a very fluid diagram. It's not something you do step 1, step 2. So this is an example, just to give you an idea of how complicated the partnership question can be even. This is an example of what we share with community colleges when we talk about developing partnerships. As you can see, just within the college, and this was for Accelerating Opportunity, just within the college, there's, I don't even know how many are there, 10-odd agencies and individuals that you need to engage around this issue in order to have the sort of robust funding conversation that you need to, because there's so many different funding streams that impact a community college. And plus the sort of political sign-off on using money differently, you have to get senior leadership there as well. Then that's just internally. Then outside, there's all these different potential partnerships as well that people might want to consider. The same is true for anyone. So in your position, if you were to reach out to a community college to form a partnership, keeping in mind there's all these internal levels that they would have to go through as well, and who would you need to actually contact, or which group of people would you need to contact, is complicated. So point being, do some thinking about partnerships and titles or individuals within a partnership as part of your process in this as well. Asset mapping. So that's where you actually sit down. Now, you've got your partners, mostly. You've got your braided funding for what are we trying to accomplish. Then you actually sit down and put every funding stream you have access to that you think is even somewhat relevant, put it on the table. And so that you've just got a pile of funding streams, funding opportunities. That includes not just the funding streams I mentioned earlier, but also grant programs that people may have where there's some flexibility. And that's not a small thing. I mean, there's a WIB I work with in Eastern Kentucky that has 17 separate federal grant programs right now. So that's a lot of headache and heartache, as well as a lot of opportunity to potentially figure out where there's some of those funding streams may overlap with the goal. The grant programs may overlap with the goal of that you've set for yourself. And then that allows you to also sort of see where you specifically do not have funding streams in the most general sense. So if you say you're serving TANF individuals and you're really trying to figure out the issue of transportation, you're in a more rural area, you constantly hear that individuals cannot get to their workplace or get to their area where the place where they're receiving training or education. You really want to focus on transportation. You notice that none of your partners at the table seem to have flexibility around transportation. You're starting to get a sense of where there's a gap. But this is really more of a step one. It's general. Put everything out there, sort it into sort of level of relevancy to your project or your goal, and then begin to identify some of the challenges you're going to face as you move forward with this. After that, you get to that second level of detail, the identifying funding priorities, and that's where, as best you can, particularly with models, where you're working with models, you need to do some cost analysis. So you need to understand what does it actually cost each of the participating organizations to support the model? What does it cost the individual if they're going through it? So if they didn't have any support, either tuition support or support for other fees and costs, what would it cost them to be able to do this program? And then so you kind of know what you have to fill for each individual that's in it. And then also break down these models, where it's a model, break it down by impact. So what in your mind are the most impactful parts of a particular model, knowing that those have funding priority number one, and then from there you can get to some of the other, wouldn't it be great to fund, but maybe you don't have enough money to fund aspects. And this is where you're getting much more specific. So you're saying, all right, so here's all our funding streams. We're beginning to prioritize them and strategies. We're prioritizing them in terms of availability, in terms of impact, in terms of relevance, and then you can actually from there start to engage in a conversation about, okay, what would we need to do to use these funding streams or to use these strategies either differently or for the first time in support of the model that we're putting in place. And that's the actual work plan, where you put something to paper. And the reason you need a work plan is because you have to have some level of accountability around this effort, and you have to have a timeline. Because like anything, like if any of you have been involved in any sort of collaborative effort, like collective impact or sector strategies or sort of national fund sites, that those efforts are only work if you have a very directed, engaged management structure where someone is leading it, people have names attached to their deliverables, there's a clear expectation around when those deliverables need to be met. That's the same is true for braided funding. You just have to have that level of kind of accountability around it. So I would encourage you to build that work plan as part of it as well. This one's pretty straightforward, just communication. So all the partners need to be in touch regularly. It depends on how often you think you need to meet, but it's not unreasonable to do it monthly early on, particularly when you're doing the planning stage of things. And then also that the regular communication allows you to identify new partnerships and new opportunities in the community that may occur. So it's an important part of it as well. And then this is where you're collecting data. So have the partners report on the impact the investments being made as best you can. Some cases they can't be measured very easily, but you need some sort of base level data so that you can make a judgment call on whether or not your work is successful in the way that you want it to be. So make sure that data analysis and evaluation and adjustment is a core part of your approach, because if it's not working, you'll have to make changes. And that's, I should say, on the not working piece, I see a lot of that. It's often not working because of various restrictions that have been put in place, either required by regulation or not in some cases, that make it onerous for the individuals to tap into it or for the partner agencies to tap into that funding stream. And so you have to keep coming back to that question, how can we make this an easier funding source to access? So the reality. So keep in mind, braided funding is, people typically when they think about it, they think it's it will answer the question of how do I get more money to pay for the great programs that I'm trying to run or to pay for the individuals that I'm trying to serve. And the answer is that's only true for some organizations. So particularly, as I said earlier, organizations like community colleges or colleges and organizations, so education providers where a lot of the funding streams lead to education. It's easier to invest in those organizations than it is to invest in organizations that may not provide that service. And so they're more likely to be able to say, all right, it's a financial benefit to my organization to do braided funding because I will actually see an investment in my organization. The flip side is for the organizations, the other organizations, the one that are making the investments, that measure your braided funding there not as a financial measure, but as an outcomes measure. So you're seeing an improvement in the success of the individuals you serve, and you define what that looks like, because you're investing in programs or investing in partners that you know do good work, and so you're getting a bigger bang for your buck, and that's how you measure braided funding in that case. That's not to say that if you're in a workforce system, for example, that you can't also see financial benefits from braided funding. You can. Like I said, particularly things like fee-for-service models, and the Workforce Innovation Fund has begun to show some examples of those that are out there. You can see some financial benefits, but it's not always as straightforward as that. So I already mentioned this. So keep a narrow and specific goal in mind. So keep as narrow as you can make it, the better for braided funding. The bigger you get, the harder it's going to be. I already mentioned the receiving versus investing. Start small, so definitely test the concept. Work with your strongest partners early on. Don't grow too quickly. You can go slowly here because, honestly, if you move too quickly and you bring in partners that are somewhat skeptical of the process or have a misunderstanding of how it's going to work, it's one of those. It's sort of like employer engagement. You only get so many chances to prove that you're actually going to be of benefit before people won't answer the phone anymore. It's the same thing with braided funding. So don't hesitate to start small. I'll skip this one because I want to get to my examples. So this is the braided funding toolkit. I'm not going to go through it because you all can do it yourself. The URL is at the end of this PowerPoint. You can go there. It's free. All you have to do is register to access it. We developed this for accelerating opportunities, so specifically around tuition strategies mostly, or support services strategies for individuals that are in integrated pathways, but that's still relevant, I think, to some of the work that you all are looking at. What's probably most helpful about this is this, which is if you want to learn more about funding streams, and it's somewhat specific to Illinois, although not really here. You can just, from the view an institution at the top there, you can select a community college in Illinois, and it'll give you some more specific information there, or at least one of the community colleges that was part of AO. But you can see here as a description of each of the funding streams. You see we're still on WIA. We haven't updated it since then, and we need to do that, although the allowability isn't that different under WIOA. But the point being is if you do want to learn more about these funding streams, there is each one of these drop-down menus. So like Perkins, for example, has a description of the funding stream, who or what organization is eligible to receive it and why. Then the performance indicators for that particular funding stream, so you can get a better sense of how it aligns with the goals of your braided funding effort, how the funds can be used based on federal regulations. So again, you've got to go to the state level. And then action steps, so how you might be able to tap into it particularly for an accelerating opportunity program. So feel free to just to go to the URL. Here it is. It's got some tools in there as well based on some of the steps that I described earlier. And you can just go to application.jff.org to that and then click on the braided funding toolkit and request access, and then you've got access to everything in there. Carla made a point about it's a little hard to do this kind of planning being the only state in the union with no budget. Yeah, I have had conversations with a number of you about the insane situation you're in right now with the budget, and I completely sympathize, and I wish that there was a quick and apparent solution on the horizon for you all, and I know it doesn't seem that way, so I hear you. As much as you're able to think about this, go for it. I also understand that with anything, there are bigger priorities out there, and you guys are facing one of the biggest challenges in the country right now, so definitely my sympathies are out to you as you try to deal with all this. Braided funding examples. So let me give you a couple quick examples, and then I'll probably stop at that point and leave just a couple minutes if there are still questions at the end. So my examples are, I think today, are primarily from Kansas and Kentucky, which are two states I work in a lot, and some of them are from Accelerating Opportunity. But these are different types of braided funding partnerships that I found were really that seemed to be really effective. So the first one, Kansas. So Kansas at the state level, this is to the question earlier about, why does TANF never really seem to be at the table or never seem to show up, and that's historically that was true in Kansas as well, that when you ask them about a TANF partnership, they essentially said, well, we don't even know who to talk to at Health and Human Services. It was kind of that bad. But the state leadership invited them to attend Accelerating Opportunity state meeting to just learn more about the model, not with any specific ask in mind. And they sent a couple representatives over to find out about it. And sort of that kicked off an ongoing series of conversations that ultimately led to an MOU between the state TANF agency and the Department of Commerce, which runs the workforce system in Kansas, where they were able to negotiate an arrangement where TANF dollars could be used to pay for tuition costs for anyone who was TANF eligible, who was also enrolled in an Accelerating Opportunity pathway, and that filled that gap we had about not being able to pay for tuition there. And it was relatively streamlined, so that there wasn't a lot of red tape around accessing it. It also allowed for people that were TANF eligible but not enrolled in TANF, so that they could be enrolled in TANF as that process played out, which opened up the door a little bit around bringing in more people. And then it also, students had to complete 12 credits, which was a requirement around Accelerating Opportunity, sort of evidence of success there. But it was a great sort of new partnership. It brought millions of dollars into the equation for TANF eligible individuals to enter into these training programs. This is another one of the SNAP pilot sites that I've been working with in Eastern Kentucky. They have a couple different approaches that I like here. One is team-based case management, where they've brought in case managers from their adult ed, their community college, and their workforce system to use a shared Salesforce platform to be able to do case management for individuals that are referred between their different systems, so that they have common notes. They do their intake processes being reviewed and streamlined across the three agencies, so that they're only collecting data once on individuals, and they're only providing where there was overlap in testing, particularly TABE testing. They're reducing that down to doing just one TABE test. And then they're also able to align their resources with individuals that have expressed particular challenges or barriers. So if they've told their college counselor that they are struggling with homelessness, they can then tap into the team-based case management system, for example, to identify a funding stream that's available to help support that. Pam, I see your question. I'm going to get to it in a second once I get through my examples here. The other thing I really like there is the Employer Resource Network, which is it's a new model. It's out of Michigan, where it's been sort of piloted the most, although it's showing up in different places now. The basic premise is that frontline workers, low-income frontline workers, so people who are being paid minimum wage in certain types of jobs, look very much like low-income individuals who are unemployed, who are receiving services, as well as low-income individuals who are in training programs, meaning that they have a number of challenges and barriers to success that require a much more sort of wraparound approach There's sort of life challenges that go beyond specific aspects of the job. And so what the ERN does is it provides case managers to employers that work with frontline workers in areas where there's a lot of turnover. And the employers can identify turnover very easily just by through their HR department or by looking at the number of tax forms they have to file and so on. They can very quickly say we have a problem with people not showing up to work and then never coming back, basically. And so what the case managers do is they're made available to the employer and to the employees directly for a certain amount of time each week to work with them on identifying strategies and funding streams that are available to address the problems that these individuals are facing, and then help that individual access those funding streams to be able to alleviate that issue. And so the sort of early evidence out of these ERNs is that they have remarkably reduced turnover among these frontline workers, and therefore the bottom line of the employer is affected positively, and then therefore they ask employers to pay the cost of the case managers, and employers pay the full cost ultimately by buying shares, so they buy access to a certain amount of time of the case manager each week or every other week. And there's been a lot of evidence, a lot of success with keeping employers engaged in those networks because they do see the return. And so what that does is, depending on how those case managers are funded, it can either, at a minimum, it's a great strategy that pays for itself. But if those case managers are also serving, for example, WIOA eligible individuals, then some percentage of the case manager's time, or even the full amount of time if they're only serving eligible individuals, might be paid for using federal funding streams, in which case what the employers are paying for to participate can become some degree of discretionary money. So it's an interesting way to sort of raise discretionary funding there, and they're just piloting it now, but I think it's a promising approach. And then this will be my last example. Another partnership between the state TANF agency and the state community college system in Kentucky. This is where the TANF agency has agreed to allow TANF funds to be made available to support two aspects of an education and training program at the community college. One is they can be used to pay the success coaches so that the individuals in this Ready to Work program receive more intensive case management with sort of smaller caseloads than they might otherwise receive at the college. And they also allow their TANF money to be used to pay for the tuition costs where necessary, as well as work study, federal works, what is equivalent of a federal work study program where the TANF money can pay for an hourly wage for the individual to work while they're also in school, which is a critical point for allowing people that don't have access to a lot of resources to be able to make some money to be able to cover their costs while they're also in school. And so the sort of brilliant thing about this is by aligning it with federal work study, it allows the TANF agency to then transition the work study off TANF and into the federal financial aid work study program without any change to the individual. So the individual doesn't know that they've moved off TANF and into the federal side other than signing a piece of paper. And what that means is you can actually keep them enrolled longer than a TANF program would allow for, since TANF is primarily short-term training. So that can get them to that year-long diploma or whatever it is that they may need to be pursuing. So the other really neat thing about this is they have really strong outcomes. So basically by providing wraparound services, case management, and by providing this work study, this financial support, they've been able to outperform, these TANF students have been able to outperform their average Pell recipient at the community college system there, which is significant because TANF recipients tend to be quite a bit lower income than Pell recipients on average. So it's a great model, and one in which there's a very direct braiding of funding happening there to make it happen. I will skip this one. That's a sort of flexible WIOA funding. So Pam, let me get to your question quickly, and then I'll leave a few minutes if people want to ask any other questions. So are there models or templates for tracking costs of braided funding projects back to funding streams, especially if using both state and local monies? Yeah, there are. The problem is that most of the work that I've done, we help with the front end of that, and then the teams do their own work on developing those templates. So I haven't worked with them directly on them. That was a similar question came up in the last session I did where people said it would be great if you could build, in addition to, so the examples I gave, turn those into case studies where it's more detailed, and then where possible link to the tools and resources that they built as part of that process. So like the templates where they actually are laying out all their funding streams, which I agree would be great. And so we're going to see if we can figure out, it's going to have to be a funded project to be able to do that, but I think that's kind of the next stage, the next era of braided funding work is to do exactly what you're asking there, to build some stuff where it's more specific to the examples of people's experience in the field doing this work. So the short answer is no, I don't know, but the long answer is we know it's a priority and we're working on it. So what next? I mean, I think, again, come back to the approach and think about where you want to go with your braided funding effort, where you are. Many of you are further along in this model than others, and so you don't need to start with create a vision. You may already have it, but jump in the other pieces here. And then, also I would encourage you to reach out to your partners to begin to learn more about their funding sources and how they can be used, open that door, and so on, just as a general conversation, not where any commitments are being made, because I think that's a critical step as well. So with that said, we have 4 minutes or less than 4 minutes until 12:30. So are there any other questions at this point?
Thank you, Nate. Chelsea's opening up all the phone lines, so if anyone wants to ask a question or make a comment via the telephone, please do at this point. As we're waiting for those, I just reiterate, our plans next week is to have a webinar on the MOU process, and so you'll be getting information on that through Kerbeck and Breckel as usual. Christy Jones sends that information out, so look in your emails to get that information. Does anyone have any questions over the telephone? I want to thank our partners who assisted with some of the information, kind of last minute to ask them. They weren't necessarily prepared, but we appreciate everything they provided. Pam does have another question. Or no, that's the one we already went through. I'm going to place the webinar link or the Illinois WorkNet link where we host all of our recorded sessions. Second here. As always, we record these and place them on the site. All right, so you can go there. All of our past webinars, this one will be posted within 2 to 3 days. So if anyone from your offices was unable to attend today, you'll be able to go back and, through that link, see those webinars as well as the document that was shared today. It doesn't appear that we have any more questions or comments. Nate, we really appreciate your time today. Very informative. Hopefully we can go back to our offices and think through some of these strategies that you mentioned, and we can start working together to build some funding options. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.